why did you want to participate in the conference at Brighton University?
Well, I've been writing about and campaigning to get Guantanamo closed for 16 years. So any opportunity really to get people together and to be able to amplify that message is a great thing to be able to do. And I'm glad it happened. I mean, Sarah and I had discussed it with some other Amnesty International members, before COVID even turned up. Thinking that it would be a good idea to do it for the 20th anniversary. And so that's what happened. I mean, obviously, it would have been a different matter if COVID hadn't happened. Then it would have been a traditional conference in the sense that presumably, some people may have traveled to it. It would probably have involved a lot of British-based academics, and it would have been, in a physical location. But I think it was quite special that it became one of those opportunities as a result of COVID to bring people together internationally in a virtual sense, which is particularly significant, I think, in terms of former prisoners who wouldn't have been able to travel even if it had taken place in a physical location. So someone like Mansour Adayfi, for example, who is in Serbia but is not allowed to travel.
Yeah. So what significance do you think the conference had on the campaign to close Guantanamo, or how do you think it was important?
Well, I hope it was noticed by people who are keeping an eye on Guantanamo. I think it will hopefully have some kind of longer presence. We're discussing bringing the papers together as a book. So that would certainly contribute to the established written record on Guantanamo, as as people making a point about why this wretched place should have been closed down such a long time ago. And I think, as I mentioned, the timing of it was very good. It was just 2 months before the 20th anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo. So I think it helped to prepare the ground for people to, pick up on that on the anniversary itself.
So moving on to talking about Guantanamo Bay itself, what would you say is the biggest reason that Guantanamo Bay remains open to this day?
I think that the lawlessness with which it was founded has led to a position of political inertia. So, Guantanamo is fundamentally wrong in every way because it was established to hold people forever without charge or trial, if that's what the United States wanted to do. And that's, that's completely unacceptable for countries that claim to respect the rule of law. You are either charged with a crime and swiftly put on trial and not tortured, it should be said as well, or you can be held according to the Geneva Conventions as a prisoner of war until the end of hostilities. But the United States did neither. So the men held at Guantanamo fundamentally were imprisoned without any rights whatsoever when the prison first opened. What happened then was that lawyers fought long and hard for many years to establish legal rights for the prisoners, and they were granted habeas corpus rights. In 2004, which allowed them to be it took until 2008 for the Supreme Court again to insist that they had habeas corpus rights, constitutionally guaranteed habeas corpus rights. There was a brief period then when judges got to look at the Guantanamo prisoners' cases and to see whether the government had a case against them. And in over 3 dozen cases, they decided that the government didn't, that they hadn't been able to establish even to the kind of lowest point of evidence that these people were associated in any meaningful or significant way with either Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Then appeals court judges started issuing rulings that eroded these habeas corpus rights and ended up gutting habeas corpus of all meaning for the prisoners. And that fundamentally happened in a number of rulings in 2010 and 2011. As a result, the prisoners were then once more back in a legal limbo. President Obama then set up a process called the periodic review boards, which were a kind of parole type process. Sorry, I should say before that, he established a review process to see what government officials meeting every week decided should happen to the men who were still held. They recommended that 2/3 of the men still held should be released, and most of those men were over Obama's 8 years in office. They also recommended that a number of men should be charged and that a number of other men should be held indefinitely without charge or trial. That was the particularly troubling bit, because they said that they were too dangerous to release, but they didn't have enough evidence to put them on trial, which means their evidence is fundamentally untrustworthy. But these are the men, and some of the men who were going to be charged are the ones who ended up going through this parole type process, which led to another 38 men being approved for release. Again, most of them were released before Obama left office. We then had 4 terrible years of Donald Trump where nothing happened, basically. And now we've got Joe Biden with a situation where he inherited 40 men. Now, 12 of these men were charged in the military commissions. 6 of them had been approved for release, and the 22 others were these forever prisoners, people who were being willfully held indefinitely without charge or trial, subject to these reviews. And so how do you get people out of Guantanamo on this basis? So, what's happened is that he's carried on with the periodic review boards. To his credit, he's approved nearly all of the forever prisoners for release. So there are now 21 out of the 37 men still held, because he released 3 men, who have been approved for release. Way over half of the men still held have been approved for release. But he has to find a way of actually releasing them. And what's crucial to recognize here, I think, is that there is no legal obligation, there's no legal mechanism to free people who have been approved for release at Guantanamo. Not when that happened in the courts, and not when that happens with these periodic reviews. Normally you would expect that if a decision, a ruling is taken, it means that fairly swiftly action to release somebody should take place, but that mechanism simply doesn't exist. So, he has to jump through hoops. He has to have any release from Guantanamo approved by Congress, because that's something that Republicans set up years ago, and it's renewed every year. And in some cases where men can't be safely returned to their home countries, then he has to negotiate with other countries to take them in, to resettle them. That can't happen in the United States, again, primarily because of Republicans, because of laws that have been passed preventing anyone from Guantanamo being able to set foot in the United States, let alone to be resettled there. So you can see, I'm sorry if this has been long-winded, but you can see that it's not a straightforward process, releasing people from Guantanamo. And all of that is the fault of the Bush administration for having set up such a lawless place in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say, how do you see the future of Guantanamo Bay going ahead? Do you think there's any chance of it closing anytime soon? How do you see the future for the site?
Well, I'm hopeful that all of these men, obviously, I think that all of these men that have been approved for release will end up being released. It's obviously taking some time to find countries for men who can't safely be sent home, like the Yemenis, for example, because Yemen is in such a terrible state. But I'm pretty sure that Biden will follow through on releasing these people. So at the moment, that would leave just 16 men in Guantanamo, and it costs $500 million a year to run Guantanamo, regardless of how many prisoners are held there. That's an insane amount of money, obviously, But also, I don't know what's going to happen with the men who have been charged. I would hope that the 5 forever prisoners that are left will also end up being approved for release and will be freed. But the men who have been charged are caught in the military commission trial system at Guantanamo, which doesn't work. They were charged like, what is it? They were charged like a decade ago, the men allegedly responsible for the 9/11 attacks. But the pre-trial hearings just go round and round. And fundamentally, it's because the defense team needs to be able to talk about the torture that they were subjected to. And the prosecutors don't want anyone to talk about the torture that these men were subjected to. And it's kind of bouncing between them and going nowhere. I could see a situation where, where these people are moved to federal court trials on the US mainland. That's possible. I could see a situation where they end up being the only people held in Guantanamo at a cost of $500 million a year for years and years as they try and make these trials succeed. I don't know what the answer is to that. But I think the way things are going, that everyone who hasn't been charged looks like they're going to end up being freed, maybe the kind of resolution to this problem that it is the closest we can get to it really being reaching any kind of conclusion. Like I say, I really can't see what they're going to do with these men who were tortured in the CIA black sites, but who they want to put on trial. There's been discussion recently that plea deals are taking place to try and negotiate some way in which they can avoid the trials, which, are we ever going to end up with them? That the men would agree to some kind of sentence, and then we'd see whether they would end up being moved to prisons on the US mainland or staying at Guantanamo. I honestly don't know on that last point, but I am reasonably hopeful that we're going to see the majority of the men still held being released before Joe Biden leaves office. And I really, really hope so.
Yeah, so that just about covers all of the questions I had for you for my article. But is there anything else you wanted to add or comment on?
I don't know. I think I've probably covered quite a lot there. I hope I didn't go on too much, but I tried to give you, the proper detailed explanation. It's, in some ways it's very simple. These men were held without rights, and that's where all the problems stem from. But the whole ins and outs of how the story has gone on over the years is quite ridiculous, really, and quite shameful for America to have embarked on this and then to have ended up with something that they don't really know how to deal with.